fact that the EJ movement is somewhat more egalitarian than the larger environmental movement. I think that's why you can see more and more women assuming those leadership roles and getting that recognition.
Talk a little bit more about that. Why do you say that the EJ movement, the environmental justice movement, is more egalitarian than the environmental movement in general?
Well, I think it's more egalitarian because the way it's structured. In many cases, the conservation environment movement or the mainstream movement is set up in a more corporate style. Boards of directors, paid staff, and a policy agenda that oftentimes is driven by national policy. Now, there are exceptions. In many cases, the organizations are headquartered in a major city and may or may not have a constituency that's based in communities. In other words, a grassroots base. If you look at most of the environmental justice movement, it is not in more corporate model. There's no, in many cases, there are no boards of directors. There's no directors or paid staffs or national agenda. In many cases, these organizations are based in communities and community focused and community driven. Their constituencies drive their work, and as opposed to the staff and the board driving the work. And so if you talk about the bottom up approach in terms of what gets done, and in terms of communities and grassroots groups and collaboration with national organizations, you can see that the big organizations from the environmental organizations, they are very different in that in many cases they are mostly white, whereas many of and most of the environmental justice movement are people of color. It's a people of color movement emerged out of anti-racism and anti-dumping and the those kinds of things. Mm-hmm. So you can see how in terms of people of color have been able to make to build their own organizations. This is not to say that there aren't environmental justice organizations that are white that are dealing with class issues and dealing with issues of poverty, etc. But for the most part, the environmental justice movement is a majority people of color movement, whereas the more traditional mainstream conservation environment movement is still largely white, with very few people of color on the boards and only a few still sprinkling in the staff.
I like the way Jerome Ringo from the Apollo Alliance and National Wildlife Federation put it when he said, the roots of the environmental movement were created by people who fish to put fish on the walls as opposed to the people who fish to put fish on the table. So it's yes. a completely different agenda when you're observing whether looking at conservation in a couple different ways.
Yes. And there's another major difference in that the environmental justice movement oftentimes put health and social justice and equity at the center of all of their work, whereas the environmental movement only recently started to deal with equity and race, and we had lots of issues early on trying to get many of the Big Ten organizations to even acknowledge that environmental racism and environmental justice were really legitimate issues to work on. For them, so we got 2 decades of educating and cajoling and convincing, and we're still not there. We've made a lot of progress in getting those groups to work with us and to challenge, largely in many cases, urban issues. And so when you talk about wilderness and wildlands and environment out there as opposed to issues in cities, etc. So. There are major differences in terms of focus and in terms of membership and in terms of agendas. And so over the last 2 decades, we've seen some convergence, coming together and collaborating and working together, not to usurp or say that we're trying to create little brown green pieces or little black National Wildlife Federations or little red Ottoman societies. The environmental justice movement still says that we would like to make sure that we grow our own leadership and that our indigenous organizations organizations that are indigenous to our communities, that's where we would like to have leadership. We speak for ourselves, and we want to make sure that people who are in communities also have the capacity to do the work for themselves. And when there's a need for working with groups that are outside of the community, then that's where we can talk about building those partnerships and those coalitions and strengthening both sides of the coin.
Do you think that the current climate crisis can really help us develop a more acute focus on environmental justice as we look at health issues and development issues in conjunction with environmental issues on a larger scale?
Yeah. I think the climate change and global warming and climate justice issues, those will be the major environmental justice issues of the 21st century. Because if you look at developing policies and developing strategies, and particularly making sure that the people that are most impacted negatively by climate change are at the table when decisions are being made as to how we're going to address policy to deal with climate change. I think it's almost like lessons that we can learn from the environmental justice movement for having an inclusionary movement and making sure that information that's disseminated is disseminated to all communities across the board, and making sure that when we develop strategies for corrective strategies, that we don't create additional problems for those communities that don't have resources to compete or get to the table and to do what's necessary to stay on board and to progress. It's almost like saying that if we're not in the room as environmental justice communities, then we can't trust the process and the end product, because the legacy is that when you are basically out of the room, oftentimes decisions are made that are not necessarily in the best interest of the people that are most impacted. Now, that's the way it has operated historically, and I don't see the issues and strategies around climate are no different. So it's important that we basically have a climate justice component in all of the climate change and global warming strategies. If not, I think we're going to make some mistakes that we'll regret as a nation and as a world. So that's why I think it's important. That's why I say it's one of the major environmental justice issues of this century.
And I think this was evidenced by the recent talks in Bali, Indonesia, where grassroots organizers were emphasizing and governments were emphasizing everybody needs to have a seat at the table. The areas and the communities that are going to be impacted most by global climate change are poor agrarian-based societies. And yeah. I think in many ways when we talk about changing light bulbs or switching to hybrids, we're missing the point of a much bigger challenge that we're facing.
Yes, and I think that's exactly right. And again, I think if we, really attach justice and equity and fairness to as a centerpiece, then I think we won't be missing, the forest for the trees. We won't be saying, well, let's do these 1-step, 2-step, 3-step. And so there are some people who are saying, well, what does poverty have to do with the issues that we're talking about? What does access to information have to do? What does, institutional barriers, land use planning and zoning and restrictions that oftentimes determine what people can live and move to, who gets the higher ground, mm-hmm. who gets first choice on the higher ground. Those kinds of things, I think, a lot of times they are unpopular and they are legacy issues, but if those legacy issues don't get uncovered, then we will basically be reproducing and building on inequity. And some of that's going on right now in New Orleans in terms of who's being protected, who's not being protected, which neighborhoods are basically receiving increased protection, and when it comes to levee protection and flood protection and all those kinds of things. Who can rebuild? Where should we rebuild? And who should get resources, who's getting loans, who's getting grants. Those kinds of things have to be factored in, because if we assume that there is no discrimination in the way that policies are made, that's a big assumption. We have, as a society, as an American society, we have not achieved race-neutral policy making and decision making yet. I wish I could say that we have, but we have not. And so if we somehow assume that things are going to work themselves out in a fair and equitable manner, and not address, the fact that people are making decisions about what's to be done, and if there are people who are at the table who are looking only out for themselves or their community in a blinding way, and not looking at what are the implications for those communities who are not at the table, I think that's something that has to be considered. And so it is a fight to get more people of color, working class people, into those meetings when we talk about strategies and solutions. And that's no different than what I was talking about when it comes to the environmental movement. Mm-hmm. I mean, it's the same struggle, the same fight, but it's the same opportunities.
The uneven evacuation during Hurricane Katrina and the subsequent uneven restoration, I think, definitely fits this pattern of injustice that you're referring to. Can you cite some other examples that people may not have thought of?
Well, I think when we talk about access to resources, when we talk about retrofitting houses and green buildings and getting more resources for saving energy and water, et cetera. When it comes to the impact of climate on, we talk about heat waves and who's most likely to be impacted during heat waves, and the incident in Chicago in the mid-'90s, is a good example of who actually died during those times. It was disproportionately low-income and people of color. And so when we talk about making sure that the impacts of climate don't necessarily fall randomly, and there are some communities that will be more impacted, and so it means that there has to be some type of resources set aside to address economic disparities that oftentimes make some populations more vulnerable. A large number of low-income folks who lived in basement apartments or in apartments that didn't have air conditioning, they died. I mean, and doing and elderly people, they died. And so it's important that people understand that the impacts of climate are not going to hit everybody in the same way. There are some groups and populations that will be more vulnerable, and that disparate vulnerability, I think, needs to be addressed in policy and addressed in the way that we talk about resource allocation. Now that when you start talking that way, some people may not start backing up, and you get pushback because you're talking about bringing in race and class factors and race and class dynamics and social dynamics, as opposed to just saying, we just want to deal with the science. Well, a lot of it has to do not necessarily with, meteorology and toxicology and hydrology. A lot of it has to do with sociology and political science. Mm-hmm. Who gets what, when, where, and why, and who's at the table and who's basically speaking up for whom. And that's where I think we need to have more environmental justice leaders, scholars, scientists, activists in this dialogue and in the room to speak up and speak for themselves. The first principle in environmental justice is that people must speak for themselves.
That's you've written about this, and there's the notion that in order to build a more sustainable society, we really need to balance out the questions of environment and economics and equity. Can you speak a little bit more to this economic piece that you just started referring to? Yeah,
I think it's important that people understand, for a long time, there was